Hello everyone and welcome to Monbiosis on COP26.tv. Now, it seems incredibly complicated, doesn't it? What do we do about climate breakdown? How do we prevent it from happening? And you can instantly get into massively detailed discussions of all the mechanisms, all the things that need to be done. But actually, on one level, it is incredibly simple. You leave fossil fuels in the ground. And perhaps because it's so simple, that is the one thing which most global leaders just won't talk about, which suggests very strongly to me that they don't actually want to see the action which they claim to want. However, there are some wonderful activists around the world who do, and who have been making real and concrete moves towards that aim. And I'm very grateful and privileged to have in the studio with me today three of these fantastic activists, people who have really already made massive waves and have got many more waves to come. And two of them come from an initiative which I think is really exciting, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty movement. And that's Tzeporah Berman and Harjeet Singh. And I'll be asking them in a moment to describe and explain what they're doing. And also in the studio with me is Guay from the wonderful Sunrise Project. And so I'm going to quickly go around the three of you to hear about your initiatives. And then we're going to talk about this crucial but fundamentally simple issue of leaving fossil fuels in the ground. So can we start with you, Tzeporah, because you're the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, which, of course, its name reflects another treaty, which is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But can you explain what your initiative is about?
Sure. Thanks, George, and it's great. It's great to be here with you all. You know, I grew up under the kind of veil of nuclear non-proliferation. And one of the reasons I love this initiative so much is because it's true, climate policy and agreements are so complicated. But what's actually pretty simple is that over 80% of the emissions that are trapped in our atmosphere today come from three products: oil, gas, and coal. And when I first started researching the supply side of fossil fuels, I was pretty horrified to find out that the Paris Agreement doesn't even include the words oil, gas, or coal, or fossil fuels. I can remember searching it going, this has to be wrong, that my computer must be wrong. And the fact is that for decades, our countries have been negotiating targets and emissions, but no one has been regulating production. Who gets to produce how much fossil fuels and what? The idea was we just leave it to the marketplace. That's not working. They're not fast enough to keep us safe. So the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is designed on the bones of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and other treaties that worked to help countries negotiate to constrain the expansion of products that threatened global security, which is what fossil fuels are today. So we know we have enough fossil fuels already under construction or dug up above ground to use while we transition out. So the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty says, let's stop the expansion, just like the first pillar of nuclear non-proliferation. Let's phase it out and wind it down in an equitable way, which means that wealthy countries need to act first, and it means that countries need to negotiate who gets to produce what and how much. Because there are countries today, especially in the global south, that are producing more fossil fuels just to feed their debt. And so this is going to require international cooperation and equity rules, and then ultimately to fast track solutions. So right now, the UN Production Gap Report shows that we're on track in the next decade to produce 120% more fossil fuels than we can burn in a 1.5 degree scenario, or it will burn us. So the Fossil Fuel Treaty is a big, new, bold idea to try and have a parallel agreement to help us meet the goals of the Paris Agreement.
Thank you, Tzeporah. Now, Harjeet, I want you to do two things for me. First of all, to explain your role within the treaty initiative, but also to explain why it is that for so long we've been talking about consumption. We've been talking about changing our light bulbs. We've been talking about electrifying our cars and the rest of it, but not about production. Just focusing on burning the stuff, but not about actually digging it out of the ground in the first place. Why do you think there is this sort of global bias in attention about this issue?
Thank you, George, for having me. So my role is to provide strategic advice, particularly on the global partnership at Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. I'm based in India, and I work with partners around the world to bring them together to support the treaty, to get endorsements, but at the same time, work on all three pillars. So as Tzeporah was explaining, the pillars around stopping expansion, phasing out, and just transition. The reality is, and George, as you said, we have been just calling for that phase out for 30 years or more. But the reality is, when you look at either the convention or Paris Agreement, we have only talked about the what part of it, but not the how part of it. And I think that is a major miss or a void that Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is trying to fill. It's about having a conversation with communities and governments on how that phase out needs to happen. Because in reality, on one hand, as you said, it's simple if there is a political will and leaders start acting upon it. But there are socio-economic consequences, because it's not just about phasing out, it's also about making sure that people have access to energy. How do we bring social justice in that transition? And that's how the terminology of just transition is extremely important. Now, coming from India, when we talk about coal, India and coal are quite synonymous. Yes, because 80% of energy continues to depend on coal and other fossil fuel sources. But the other aspect that we also need to realize, and which is true for India and many other developing world countries that are dependent on coal, is the employment part of it. In India, for instance, 3.6 million people are directly or indirectly employed. So when you make that transition, what happens to them? A coal miner cannot become a solar engineer, which is also gaining so much of traction in a country like India. 40% of Indian districts have some kind of coal dependency. So that phase out that needs to happen, it has to happen in a much more planned and orderly manner, ensuring equity and justice. And that's where the role of global community is absolutely important, to ensure that equity and justice. How do we support these countries and communities to make that transition?
Thank you, Harjeet. And Justin, I want you to tell me about the Sunrise Project, but also to explain the global role of activism in making changes like this happen.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, George. So just to put our work in perspective, Sunrise Project is focused on how we leverage or harness the role of the financial system to accelerate the transition beyond fossil fuels. The reason we're focused on finance is, as our dear friend Bill McKibben says, money is the oxygen on which the fire of global warming burns. So if we stop pouring more fuel onto that fire, we can help stop the climate crisis. So we are focused on the net zero pledges here at COP that every financial institution under the sun seems to want to be making these days, and ensuring the integrity of those pledges. And I think the best way to judge the integrity is to judge what side of the bright red line they land on. Are they leaving fossil fuels to the side, or are they going to continue to finance fossil fuels even as they say they are aligned with Paris, as they are aligned with the net zero transition? And as Tzeporah was saying earlier, it seems quite clear that nearly everybody wants to say the words net zero. They want to commit to net zero. Nobody wants to commit to ditching fossil fuels. And ultimately, money matters to fossil fuels, but fossil fuels don't matter to money. So there's absolutely no reason the financial system needs to be a part of the global wrecking crew. But just to go to your question, what is the role of activism? I think what you often hear with finance, with economics, with the global transition is that the economics are shifting quite radically. The coal industry, for one, is a walking zombie. It's neither alive and sustainable, nor is it dead and dying. It's living as a kind of a zombie that just won't go away. And meanwhile, it's wreaking havoc on the planet, on our communities. And unfortunately, while we like to believe that financial institutions are rational creatures that make decisions based on the underlying economics, the reality is they don't. And it requires political pressure. It requires activism to force these institutions to do the right thing. And so that's a big part of what we and a network of many partners around the world are focused on trying to do.
Thanks, Justin. Well, Tzeporah, Justin's given us a very good rundown of the difference between what the financial sector says it's doing and what it's actually doing. But we also see a similar gulf among the oil majors and the other big fossil fuel producers, because if you look at their advertising, it looks as if they've made almost 100% transition into renewables, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. But then but despite the growth that they say they're putting towards renewables, if you look at the capex expenditure of those big companies, you see that the top five, which are responsible of the majority of oil production on the planet, have put about 1% of their budget towards renewables. And I think the work of the Sunrise Project and the work of divestment activists and citizens around the world is absolutely critical. I think that's right. We have to move the money, and we also have to hold governments to account, which is why we started the Fossil Fuel Treaty Project, because right now governments are distorting the markets. Even when we're seeing trillions of dollars move out of fossil fuels and more statements, we're seeing our governments pour more and more money into subsidizing fossil fuels in order to keep projects alive. I mean, my own government, Prime Minister Trudeau, a climate leader in a lot of ways, nationwide carbon tax, zero emission vehicle commitments, just bought a $20 billion tar sands pipeline, which was a lifeline for that industry. The investors have moved out because the fact is that renewables in almost every country now are cheaper than fossil fuels. But if you look at COVID spending, it was horrific. $230 billion in COVID recovery funds from the G20 nations to fossil fuels. So our governments are propping up this industry when it should be in decline in order to allow cleaner and safer renewable choices. And here at COP, quite frankly, the net zero pledges are a cover-up for that. It's a fraud, because our countries and all of these big companies are saying that they can continue to expand fossil fuel production and emissions. And they can just work on intensity emissions reductions and planting trees and carbon sequestration technologies. And I think we all know here, and likely most of your listeners do, that we need that carbon sequestration, but not to justify more fossil fuel expansion.
Harjeet, the speed at which fossil fuel investment has to decline and fossil fuel use has to decline, I mean, it's really extraordinary, isn't it? There was a paper in Nature published a couple of months ago which suggested that just to stand a 50% chance of staying within 1.5 degrees of global heating, we need to divest from 90% of coal and, 60-something% of oil and gas by 2030. Is this feasible? Is this possible?
Well, it is possible. We have technology, we have resources. So on one hand, developing countries have to be ready for that transition, and rich countries have to put money on the table. And if you look at what happened just a couple of days ago, rich countries failed to mobilize even $100 billion, which is supposed to be a seed money to attract those trillions that are required to make the transition, George, that we are referring to. And that is not happening. As a developing country, if I don't see even $100 billion a year committed, how do I make a shift in my policy and investment? And we are talking about developing countries. On one hand, that's where the maximum potential is to make that transition, to move away from fossil fuels and make future investments. At the same time, they also have massive development deficit. We cannot ask them to use their own national budget to shift it from education, health and infrastructure and turn everything green. So this is exactly the reason these climate conferences, which is a place for global justice, which is a place for cooperation, where rich countries have to support developing countries in making that transition. And money is extremely important to make that transition happen. So both developing countries and developed world has to come together. And the reality is, if I speak as a citizen, George, there is so much of awareness about how India as a country is also facing massive air pollution. So there are environmental degradation issues. There is a displacement happening of communities. Talk to indigenous people. There's pollution. There's health issue. There's also corruption, child labor. So we all want to move away from fossil fuel, and it's so urgent for so many reasons.
Yes, one figure I saw recently, I think it might have been in your materials, was that 1 in 5 of all global deaths are now being caused by pollution. Can that possibly be right? That's an extraordinary figure.
That's the Harvard study that came out last year, which was just really shocking. But I mean, if you live with it, you understand it, right? At every point along the fossil fuel chain, we are poisoning people, from the extraction and the poisons in the water, and people living downstream, to the refining, to the use of it, and people living near highways, and we have never really added it up like that all the way along to really look at that. And what's shocking, and one of the reasons we need to move so quickly now, is that now we know, and we have alternatives. It's countries like the wealthy countries. In the case of India, it's Australia that's digging up that coal. It's Australia that has just committed to 4 new coal projects, while simultaneously saying they're committed to net zero just in the last couple of months. And that coal is being exported to countries like India and then poisoning people there. And so we really need the big wealthy countries, Norway, the UK, Canada, the US, Australia. They have to step up and stop hiding behind net zero and commit to stopping fossil fuel expansion.
So, Justin, when countries like Australia are challenged on this, they say, well, it's jobs. We've got to preserve those mining jobs. How do you answer that?
Well, I think it's pretty tough to cling to the jobs of the past. I mean, you think back to other transitions we've seen, economic transitions, and it'd be pretty foolish to think of country governments defending Blockbuster in its desperate attempt to sell the last cassette tape. I think it's very difficult to imagine that as leadership, to imagine that as preparing your society for the future and ensuring that you're going to have employment as the global economy transitions. So it's something that they all say, but it's very difficult to take at face value given the transition we know that is inevitable, that's happening all around us.
Now, something very striking in all this is the role of public finance, because, Justin, if I can stay with you for a moment, you spelt out very clearly the role of private finance, but of course there's also government agencies, government-run banks, international intergovernmental banks. They still seem to be pouring money into fossil fuels. Why?
Yeah, so if we go back to the Paris Agreement, it was signed back in 2015. You fast forward to today, those very public institutions have poured billions of dollars into the expansion of coal, oil, and gas since the Paris Agreement was signed. And so it's as though nobody seemed to inform them that we signed this world-changing agreement and we need to radically change what we're doing. And I think it's back to what Tzeporah has been saying, which is that everybody seems to be comfortable talking about net zero and climate in the abstract, but when the rubber hits the road, which is all about what we do about fossil fuels, nobody seems to be willing to take the hard decisions. That being said, I do think you do see some important signs of leadership. The UK government has stepped out and said we're going to stop providing export credit to coal, oil, and gas around the world. The United States government is starting to get into the same position. So it's starting to change. It's just far too slow for the time scale and the time frame that we're on.
There's two even more inspiring examples. I mean, I'd hesitate to say what the UK and the US are doing are inspiring, but at least, as you say, it's in the right direction. But what Denmark and Costa Rica are doing, now that is quite exciting, Harjeet.
Well, absolutely. And we need such leaders to step up and move beyond geopolitics and move beyond, pointing fingers and blaming and saying, you first step up, otherwise it's going to impact my economy. The kind of leadership they have shown are really examples for other leaders to follow. And that's what we need. When we keep saying that it's a global crisis, it's an emergency, you can't just remain stuck in geopolitics and your vested interest and looking inwards. That's exactly the reason we all come together on such a global platform.
And those two countries, Tzeporah, they've set up this Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, and they're calling on other countries to join them. Do you think there's much prospect that will happen?
I think there is. I think we're going to see a kind of coalition of the first movers, coalition of the willing form around Denmark and Costa Rica's commitment. We're going to hear more about the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance this week here at COP26, and I expect there are a number of other countries and maybe even subnationals that will start to join, and that will create movement. I think that this is the first step towards a more comprehensive fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, and I'm really excited about what BOGA's doing. And there's a lot of the fact is there is a lot of good news. I agree with Justin when he said that. Just last week, we saw the report that said that it was over 1,400 institutions in 10 years who have divested, and it's representing $39 trillion. We have over 2,500 scientists that have endorsed the fossil fuel treaty. 101 Nobel laureates, including the Dalai Lama, and now parliamentarians from around the world, over 100 of them from 24 countries, have endorsed the principles of a fossil fuel treaty. And it's their own initiative, encouraging other parliamentarians to sign on. So there is actually a lot of movement, and I think I feel like there's a shift now in a recognition of the ambition that we need to address stopping the expansion and production of fossil fuels.
So how do we make sure that shift starts to affect the real holdout countries like Canada and Australia, for example, which are behaving in such an antisocial way?
We don't stop. We hit the streets. We take lessons from the youth, dust off those placards if you're not a youth and you haven't been out there in a while. Call your members of parliament, call your MLAs, and encourage your financial institutions to divest. Should move your money if they haven't. We need to all take individual action, but not just in our lifestyle. It's not what we buy. It's about how we're encouraging our decision makers to make better laws and better regulations. And with the fossil fuel treaty, we're really focusing on the campaign, getting cities to pass motions, getting individuals to join up, and really, encouraging groups around the world to take it and run with it, and join us at fossilfueltreaty.org, because countries are going to act if they know that they have support for making the hard choices, and if they know that there will be consequences for their inaction.
Justin, we're often told, well, we would love to act, but it's really expensive switching to renewables and other sources. Could you give us a rundown of the economics of this?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question, George, because that is about as outdated of a view of the world as I could possibly imagine. But it's one that the coal industry in particular clings to because they don't want to expose their vulnerability. So if you look at basically every mainstream analyst's report or findings, right now it is cheaper to build new wind and solar plus storage than a new coal plant basically everywhere in the world. It's actually cheaper to build new wind and solar and storage than operate an existing coal plant that's depreciated, which should be the cheapest power on earth. So the question is, why are we still running these coal plants? Why are we still planning to build new coal plants today? And that's because they're propped up in regulated markets with subsidies from governments, with capacity payments, which are literally zombie payments. We pay these things to continue to zombie on and not shut down. And so what we're talking about here is if you look at the remaining value in, for instance, the United States coal fleet, it's $10 billion. If we could muster $10 billion, we could buy out and retire every single coal plant in the United States. For the measly sum of $150 to $200 billion, we could buy out and retire every single coal plant in the world and buy back our future. And so I think when we're talking about the use of money, we need to think about the wise use of money, because our entire theory of change is oriented around how the market will hasten this transition and how we will ensure market dynamics kick in. But the reality is the market has already shifted, and these zombies continue to linger on. And so we're going to need governments to act, and we're going to need to use public money wisely to retire these assets once and for all, and to take care of communities along the way, because it's not just about ensuring the investors who made these terrible and stupid decisions, making sure that they are taken care of. It's about making sure that the communities that have been living with the toxic burden in their lives are taken care of. And so I think the thing we really need to open our eyes to, at least with the coal industry, is that it's an incredibly fleetingly small amount of money to get rid of this industry. And it's time that we did that, because they've been hiding behind the illusion of power and scale for far too long. And the reality is there are just a very, very small hindrance on the way to a clean energy future, and we just need to push them out of the way.
So Harjeet, the three of you have made a very compelling case for this transition. Why isn't it happening? What's stopping governments from doing exactly what Justin has just laid out?
Well, I mean, one is there's massive inertia, and as you were, George, talking about the importance of public finance, not only in the investment sector, but also we have to make a massive economic shift, and the diversification that is required is of an unimaginable scale, let's face it. But governments have not even taken that step. The whole concept of just transition is only gaining momentum now. And for that, we have to do all kinds of things, starting from setting up a time frame. Each country has to do that. While we are talking of net zero, we know that a lot needs to happen in the near term. We have to involve communities, as Justin was saying. They are going to be affected. They have been dependent on it as their major source. We have to find alternative employment opportunities for them. And as I said, at the economic level, the diversification needs to happen. We need to build social and physical infrastructure. So the change that is required on ground is massive. So governments have to take that lead. Imagine if rich countries are saying that, because of jobs and because of that massive shift, they are unable to do that. Imagine what developing countries are going to face. So you need leaders in the rich world to set that example. Of course, each country has to develop its own plan for just transition. And then how do we support each other? So it's not rocket science. It's going to be complex. It's going to be massive, but we all need to come together to make that just transition. And one positive thing that, as you were referring to examples, Europe has set up a fund of 17 billion euros for just transition. Now, why can't we have a similar fund at the global level to support that transition? So there are those ideas which now need to be scaled up.
Thank you, Harjeet. Now, we're coming close to the end of the program. Tzeporah, could you spell out a vision of what the world will look like if and when this transition that you're pushing for takes place?
What a great question, George. We already see it in pieces all over the world. We're talking about cities that are more livable, where people can afford and have clear options to make public transportation easy and accessible and faster and fun. We're organizing our cities so that people can easily walk to where they need to go to get their groceries, to see their friends. That our houses and our buildings are passive solar, are hooked up to the grid, so that we're not using gas in our houses, which is actually one of the huge health implications that we're just starting to really understand. Fracked gas, cooking with it, heating our homes with it, it's poisoning us, and now we know that. And so we're going to see houses and cars hooked up to the grid, which means renewable energy, both being produced right on our homes, but also heat pumps at a district level and in our homes. So it's cleaner, it's safer. We actually use less energy because things are more efficient. And so our bills are lower overall. And we already see a lot of those solutions at play in different cities around the world. We have the technology to do this. We don't know what aviation is going to look like in the future, and we don't know what large-scale shipping is going to look like. But there's already a lot of interesting solutions that are looking at how we can decarbonize both of those sectors. And while people like to blame it on aviation, and certainly on an individual, one flight is probably equivalent to being vegetarian for 4 years. So we do need to think about our lifestyle choices. Aviation globally is about 2% of our fossil fuel use and emissions. So we can reduce fossil fuel use if we have the right systems in place for the majority of uses today. But one point I want to make, George, which I think is really critical, part of the reason we're not is because of the influence of the big oil, gas, and coal companies. And we haven't really talked about that here today, but I think it's important for people to realize that, pro-fossil fuel ads from the industry, just in the US alone in the last year, 431 million times played on Facebook, just on Facebook alone. So we are being inundated every day with billions of dollars being spent to convince us that we can't make this change, that it's going to harm people and cost more, and it's not true. First, they told us that climate change wasn't true, and they denied the science for 30 years, and now we've proven that in US courts and courts around the world. And now they're flooding us with ads to tell us that it's going to be too hard, that it's going to hurt us. But it's not. It's going to be safer, and it's going to be cleaner, and it's going to protect our kids.
Tzeporah, Harjeet, Justin, thank you so much for a great discussion. And please, everybody watching this, stay tuned to COP26.tv, which, as you've just heard, cuts to the heart of the matter.